Hi everyone, welcome back to Sips or Change. As always, we're your hosts, Martin and Tammy, here to bring you exciting conversations about making events more planet and people conscious.
Okay, Martine, before we jump in, if I ask you, what is the first thing you think about when someone says sustainable events? What would you say?
Mm, easy. Social inclusion.
Okay, I should have expected that.
What? Why do you say that?
It's because I was hoping you would say something else, but as I should have expected, since you're so passionate about social sustainability, that would be the first thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah. I see. Well, if you ask me what is the first thing that you would think of when someone says sustainable events, then I would say carbon footprint.
Yes, that's where I was going with this. Because for today's topic, we're diving into something that should be on everyone's minds, carbon estimation and calculation for events.
And even though this wasn't the first thing on my mind, it's still such an important subject. Whether you're just starting to explore it or you've been around the block a few times, there's always something new to learn.
In the efforts to not overwhelm our audience with all this technical conversation that we could and might have, we'll break it into two parts. So today for part one, we're going to start with the basics, what carbon estimation is, and learning the right terminology and ultimately why it's crucial and important.
Yeah, and then in part two, we'll dive deeper into the more advanced parts of how to start measuring, understanding the process, including tools and resources for those of you who are a little further along in the journey. Now, Tammy, take it away.
Alrighty, let's start with the basics. Carbon estimation can become really overwhelming, especially when you're just starting to dive into it, especially for those who haven't taken a science class or been involved in any type of science since probably secondary school.
um, Seriously, sometimes when you mention all of the numbers, like in carbon tones, my brain gets all mushy and dizzy. I was always more into letters than numbers, to be honest.
I totally understand. And I know it can be confusing because many of us don't have a frame of reference. It's not like a unit of measure that we use often, like miles or kilometers. So let's start there.
Yeah, what is the carbon footprint and why is it measured in carbon tones?
Okay, this is where I sometimes nerd out. But I'm going to try to not to bore everyone with too much detail. But a carbon footprint is the total amount of greenhouse gases that are generated by our actions. And the greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and a combination of fluorinated gases. These are the gases that are emitted into the atmosphere and contribute to climate change.
Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the one we hear most about because it is one of the leading contributing greenhouse gases, right? And I do remember, even if I was really bad at it, from science class that CO2 is what humans and animals exhale when they breathe. So, do the number of animals and humans affect the amount of greenhouse gas emitted?
You're absolutely right that we do exhale CO2, and the amount of living things on the planet do kind of affect the amount of CO2 and the other greenhouse gases emitted, but it's honestly more complicated than that, which is why carbon estimation is so tedious. So, a quick step back to primary school science class. Um, Living things inhale oxygen and then exhale carbon dioxide, which is CO2, which typically is absorbed by plants when they use to make more oxygen through photosynthesis, which in the world of sustainability, we discuss that as carbon sequestration.
Right. And this primarily refers to the process of removing CO2 from the atmosphere in efforts to reduce the impact of climate change. So, when people talk about carbon credits or carbon offsets, they're referring to initiatives or projects that are geared towards doing specifically that, such as planting trees.
Exactly. So now going back to your question, Martine. If it was just breathing alone, yeah, the amount of nature on the planet, in theory, should be able to offset and sequester the amount of CO2s from all of the peoples and animals.
Mm.
However, we're not just breathing, right? We're burning fossil fuels for energy, we're drilling oil for fueling our planes and our cars, and all of these things generates more greenhouse gases.
And this is why all of our actions and choices directly contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and, in turn, our carbon footprint. And for even planners who are still learning about sustainability, it is so important for us to understand this part when we're starting to think about the carbon footprint of our events.
Precisely. And because of this, a lot of event planners may not know where to start when it comes to carbon estimation. It can really feel like a daunting task, which is why we prefer to use the word estimation versus calculation, because in reality, we won't be able to get to a precise number and a calculation of the exact footprint of the event, but we can get as close as possible with an estimation. So as long as you know where and what to measure.
That's a great segue to this next part. We should understand the terminology before we even get into the measuring. When you get into carbon reporting, you'll often see the terms like net zero and carbon neutral. So let's chat a bit more about what these actually mean.
You'll often hear net zero and carbon neutral used interchangeably, and both do result in removing CO2 from the environment, but the two terms are not the same. The Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, which is a corporate climate action organization that supports companies globally in combating the climate crisis, actually does not use that term carbon neutral at all. Carbon neutral is used more by the businesses referring to the use of carbon offsets and not necessarily mean that they have made efforts to reduce their direct emissions at all.
Hmm. And carbon neutrality typically only focuses on carbon and not the rest of the greenhouse gases. Meanwhile, according to the SBTI and their corporate net zero standard, net zero refers to the process of reducing all greenhouse gas emissions and then neutralizing the remaining emissions after reduction.
The term neutralization is used for when companies take measures to sequester carbon. And according to the corporate net zero standard, which is a framework for corporate net zero target setting following the climate science based guidelines for limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius, most companies need to reduce at least 90% of their emissions while neutralizing the rest.
So if you hear of companies having a net zero commitment, that means they're committed to reducing at least 90% of their total emissions and investing in projects that sequesters carbon from. While a company being carbon neutral may only be investing in projects that sequesters carbon.
In addition to those terms, when you start measuring your carbon footprint, you also encounter terms like scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This is important to understand because depending on what type of climate action goals your company is committed to, if any, your event's carbon footprint may or may not directly affect those goals.
Precisely. Here's the difference between the scopes of emissions. Scope 1. Emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the reporting company. This could include computers to vehicles that are owned or controlled by the reporting company. Scope 2 are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from energy consumption for use in business operations. In this example, scope 2 for the reporting company would be the electricity physically generated at the facility, which falls into the scope 1 category for the power generator company. Scope 3 are indirect greenhouse gas emissions not captured in scope 2 that occur in the value chain of the reporting company. So this would include the distribution or disposal of goods after reaching the consumer.
Notice how Martin said value chain and not supply chain. There is a distinct difference between the two as well. A value chain is the full range of activities that businesses engage in to bring a product or service from conception to the customer. Therefore, as an example, the value chain includes the sourcing of raw materials to make the product, as well as the marketing and shipping of the final product.
And here is where you can start to see how complex carbon estimation can get, especially when you get specific about where your emissions are coming from.
Okay, I know we got a bit technical, but let's bring this all back to events and start talking about how this plays into event planning.
Absolutely. When we're talking about events, both live and virtual, there are always carbon emissions contributing to a broader carbon footprint. You can estimate the carbon footprint of your event separate from the carbon footprint of your company or business, or it can be part of your company's overall footprint.
For instance, when hosting a virtual hybrid event, the computers and the equipment used to run the platform would be considered part of your Scope 1 emissions. Then for live in-person events, the electricity used to power the lighting in the venue would count under Scope 2 emissions. And lastly, the food served at the event and the attendee travel to and from the event would be considered Scope 3 emissions.
See, that was a lot, wasn't it? So let's pause there and wrap up for today. In part two, we'll continue to dive a bit more into what to measure, including the how, along with the tools and resources you can use to help you along the way.
Thanks, Martine. For our audience, if you loved today's episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you're always in the loop.
Thanks for sipping with us. We'll see you next week for another deep dive. Until then, keep making conscious choices one sip at a time. Bye.
Bye.